Hi there, this is Rob from Auburn Amps. I did a video a while ago about rolling 9-pin dual triode preamp tubes, and I promised in that video that I would do one about rolling output tubes, so this is it. I wish I could be delivering some good news, that it was as easy to roll output tubes as it is to roll preamp tubes, but unfortunately it's not. It's kind of another kettle of fish and a can of worms as well. I'm sure there's a joke in there somewhere, but we don't have time for that. Some of the same things apply. You should do tube rolling with a helper. Why? Because you can't remember what a sound was by the time you've let tubes cool down and changed them and warmed your amp up again. It's just a fact of life. We don't have enough sonic memory for that. So tube roll with a helper, and don't let them tell you what tubes are in the amp. They can put the same ones in twice in a row and try to fool you. This way you can train your ear to detect the differences between them. And if you can't detect differences, well, then you're a lucky person, because you don't have to spend a lot of time and money. You've found that you're fine with what's in there. Now, the reason rolling output tubes is much more challenging than rolling preamp tubes is, well, the cost for one thing, but there are so many incompatibilities that can creep in. You can't just plug in another set of 8-pin octal tubes just because they'll fit. Doesn't mean they'll work. The kinds of things that you'll run into, well, first and foremost, is bias. You should always be changing the bias, adjusting the bias when you change output tubes, even with the same type. And definitely when you're changing to a different type, even if it's compatible with the amp, you have to change the bias. If you can do that yourself, if you have one of the inline bias adapters and you're confident with the process, then that's great. If not, it's something a tech should do, because generally the bias has to be adjusted inside the amplifier, and the measurements have to be done in there too. So it's a job for a tech, someone who's confident and skilled in working around high voltages. And let's see, what other discrepancies you can run into? The size of the tube. For one thing, many of the output tubes are quite different in size, and even there are variations between older and newer versions of tubes. So even if a tube will fit electrically and work in the amplifier, it might not fit physically. And it's not just fitting the area around the socket, it's whether the retainer and the covers will still fit over the tube. So you need to check into that. Another biggie is the pin out. The pin assignments are not universal in all these output tubes. There's some that are, like the filament is almost always, or I could say always, between pins 2 and 7 in octal, pentode, or tetrode output tubes. You can count on that. But things get sticky when you're talking about the grid connections. A tetrode has 2 grids, a pentode has 3 grids, and these are sometimes assigned to different pins than what's expected. Another problem that can crop up is that an amp might have connections going to unused pins for the tubes that it was designed for. For example, Fender would use pins 1 and 6, those terminals on the sockets, as a convenient place to anchor resistors, which is all fine and good if you're using the tubes that amp was designed for. But if you plug in a different type, you might find that you're shorting your power supply to ground or worse. So that's something to watch for. Another biggie is the filament current requirements of the tube you're putting in. It might be much higher than what the amp was designed for, and the filament current draw is fixed. It doesn't depend on how hard you're pushing the amp. So if you plug in a tube that needs 1.6 amps of filament current into an amp that's only expecting to provide 900 milliamps to that socket, then you're probably going to fry the power transformer eventually. If anything, it will get very, very hot, and that can be a dangerous situation. So you always have to check to see whether the tube you're plugging in is compatible in terms of the filament current draw that it has. Another thing that you might run into is the plate voltage. Your amp might be putting out 700 volts for the plate. For some amps, the plate voltage is quite high, like Music Man amps for some example. And so if you plug in a 6L6 in there, and it's got a maximum plate voltage of 500 volts, then you're going to have a very brief and expensive light show on your hands. So you have to check that as well. Something that's less of a safety concern, but something to be aware of anyway, is that each tube type is looking for a certain plate load. In a push-pull configuration, it's the plate-to-plate impedance that we're talking about. Now, tubes are fairly flexible in that respect. They will operate into a range of loads, but if you're exceeding the target median load by a 2-to-1 ratio, then you need to look at adjusting the load on the output, in other words, the speakers. So if you've got a 6L6 amp and you want to put 6 V6s in there, you have to be aware that the 6L6 is expecting to see a 5K plate-to-plate load. The 6 V6 is looking for about a 10K plate-to-plate load. And so the way you get around that is by putting a speaker of twice the impedance on the output, and that impedance gets reflected back to the tubes through the ratio of the output transformer. So if you double the output load, then you double not the weight of, not the magnitude of the load, but the impedance we're talking about. If you put a 16 ohm speaker on an 8 ohm output, and the primary of that transformer was loaded with 5K before it, now it's going to be comfortable with 10K. I hope that's clear. If not, there's a chart that I've included in the blog entry on this topic on my website at auburnamps.com. You can check that out, and it's got a lot more detail than I can squeeze in here. But in short, you really need to do your homework before plugging in different types of output tubes. One thing to make note of, your amplifier will have come stock with a certain type of tube, of course, and that tube type, it would be written on a little paper chart inside the amp or inside the manual. Now, some tube types were not available for a while, like the 7591 was completely unavailable for about 10 years. So a lot of those amps got rewired for 6V6s, for example. The tech who did that should have noted that on the tube chart or in the manual or somewhere on the amp, but you can't count on that. So if you have doubts, then take your amp to a tech and have them measure or check what's actually on the pins of those output tube sockets and make sure that you're not going to do any damage to the substitution you want to do. And let's see, what else can I tell you? Have a look at the chart. I'll show you the chart here just so you can get a sense of what it's like. It's a little bit overwhelming, but there's a lot of information packed on there. And on the blog there's a second chart that sort of explains where all these discrepancies come from. And you look at the tube that your amp is designed for in the left column, and then you scoot across along that row to find the tube that you'd like to put in, and those letter codes, those color-coded letter codes, will tell you whether or not it's going to work and what kinds of things you might run into. Green means that it's a go. You can just go ahead and do it. As you can see, there's not a lot of green on the chart. Almost any type of substitution comes with things that you need to watch for. It doesn't mean that it's impossible for your amp, but you need to know what voltages are on what pins and whether the tube you're going to put in is indeed going to be compatible before you do it and potentially not only cost yourself a set of output tubes, but maybe even the output transformer and turn that amp of yours into a boat anchor. Not fun. I also want to mention that changing output tubes, if you look at tube manufacturers' charts and a lot of online discussions, people will be saying, oh, I like the KT66, it's got a great mid punch to it, and you hear these kinds of descriptions. But the differences between power tubes are actually quite subtle, especially if they're operating into the impedance they're supposed to. So don't expect a completely different tone when you change output tubes. The effect is going to be subtle and something to be aware of, because you don't want to spend a lot of money trying tons of different output tubes. It's better if you can borrow them from a friend, actually, or buy them from a place who will let you send them back if you're not happy with them. That's the best because tubes are quite expensive. And unfortunately, they hit that price point, that magic price point that manufacturers love, between $100 and $500. That is the amount that a lot of people are willing to part with on a purchase that they haven't really fully researched, and they can kind of forgive themselves for that if it's not a ton of money. But it's much better to do your homework and not waste your money chasing after subtleties, because at the end of the day, the tone is in your hands, the groove is in your heart, and that's what you need to keep in mind when you're doing this. So anyway, that's a quick synopsis of rolling output tubes. I'm sorry that it's not a big fat green light. You really need to do your homework before doing it, and be super careful, because if you get a shock, it's not only the lethal voltage, but a secondary injury might happen. You might cut yourself when you're pulling your hand back from the amp chassis, or you might knock it off its stand onto the floor or on your foot. It's expensive and injurious to make that sort of mistake. So be careful. Don't dig around in there if you really don't know what you're doing. It's worth paying a tech to save your amp, to save your neck. Okay, that's all I'm going to say about that. This is Rob from Auburn Amps. Oh, one more thing. Yeah, I'm always a little surprised that people like and subscribe to these off-the-cuff, no-budget videos, but I'm glad you like the content, and please do subscribe. It gives me a sense of what kinds of videos you'd like me to do. So this is Rob from Auburn Amps, wishing you once again a day full of music. Thanks for watching.